Welcome back to part 2 of our debunk of Walkfree's 2023 Global Slavery Index. In the last video, we tore through Walkfree's latest report that claimed that 1 in 10 North Koreans were living in conditions of modern slavery. Walkfree put the Democratic People's Republic of Korea as the number 1 offender above Eritrea. As you may have guessed, their reasonings were completely bunk and based almost entirely on debunked defector testimony and US government propaganda. Spoiler alert, their reasoning and sources for the People's Republic of China parts of this report are also based on complete nonsense. It's the same Red Scare / Yellow Peril propaganda that we covered in part 1. It's xenophobia time. For more coverage of Western CIA-funded propaganda against the People's Republic of China, check out my video on the Volkswagen protests done by the World Uyghur Congress, right here on this channel. And once again, here's the Walkfree report that we're breaking down. 2023 Global Slavery Index from Walkfree. In this report, Walkfree's ranking puts the People's Republic of China at number 110. Meaning 109 countries supposedly have a higher prevalence of modern slavery. Like the United States at number 121, they don't even crack the top 100 worst offenders. But Walkfree claims that the People's Republic of China has over 6 million people in modern slavery. That's over 5 times the amount that the US supposedly has. But since China has over 5 times the population of the US, it puts them at a similar ranking. Walkfree sorts these countries' ranking by per capita, which is probably the best way to do it. Despite the US and China's rankings being so close, this report makes it seem like slavery is a much worse problem in China, of course. And to do that, they use US propaganda. The funny thing is that the US constantly fearmongers about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Yet according to this report, per capita they have about the same prevalence of modern slavery as China. Perhaps they should worry about their own slavery problem instead of making up lies about the People's Republic of China. And as I'm about to prove, the Walkfree report is lying about the prevalence of modern slavery in China, because they base it almost exclusively on US-funded propaganda. This means the US is clearly worse. We have extensive proof of prison slave labor in the USA. You don't need to look any further than the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. We have zero proof of Uyghurs being kept as slaves. Here's a blurb from the report about state-imposed forced labor. Reports indicate that state-imposed forced labor occurs in public and private prisons around the world, including Brazil, China, North Korea, Poland, Russia, Turkmenistan, the United States, Vietnam, and Zimbabwe. Under footnote 9 for the United States, we have 5 sources, all teeming with actual evidence. We have lawsuits from the NAACP alleging prison labor is tantamount to slavery, class action lawsuits, and International Labor Organization reports with actual data. Footnote 4 for China has just one link. It's a report from Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. It's titled, Until Nothing is Left, China's Settler Corporation and its Human Rights Violations in the Uyghur Region, a report on the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. The first thing I like to do when I pull up one of these reports is search it for a few red flags. And we're going to do something a little bit different in this video. We're going to keep a running tally of the times these red flags are mentioned. A search for the word Zens shows 13 citations from the CIA-funded Christo-fascist that believes God sent him to Earth to westernize China and that Jews will perish in the rapture. Adrian Zenz is a senior China fellow at the CIA-funded Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. You can read more about him on my Substack article. A search for Radio Free Asia shows 5 citations from the CIA operated news agency that exists to spread propaganda about America's geopolitical enemies. They exclusively source anonymous, non existent people in their lies about China and North Korea. You can read more about Radio Free Asia on my Substack article. A search for Australian Strategic Policy Institute shows 7 citations from the think tank funded by the Australian Department of Defense, the US government, American corporations like Facebook and Google, and several defense contractors like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. Again, you can read more about the ASPI on my Substack article. A search for Uyghur Human Rights Project shows 6 citations from the National Endowment for Democracy funded think tank that is connected to the World Uyghur Congress, which is also NED funded and supports the terrorist group East Turkestan Islamic Movement. The National Endowment for Democracy is administered by US Congress, and the founder admitted it exists to do overtly what the CIA used to do covertly. They fund dozens of Uyghur advocacy groups, quote unquote, like the Uyghur Human Rights Project and the World Uyghur Congress, that spread lies about Xinjiang and the People's Republic of China. You can read more about the National Endowment for Democracy on my Substack article. A search for Center for Strategic and International Studies shows 3 citations from the Washington, D.C. based think tank. From Wikipedia, the Center for Strategic and International Studies lists major funding from defense contractors such as Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon Company, and General Atomics. Significant funding has come from the governments of the United States, Japan, Taiwan, and the UAE. This think tank is funded by defense contractors and basically all of China's geopolitical enemies. Yeah. And finally, a search for Jamestown Foundation shows one result from the Washington, D.C. based conservative think tank, headed by various advisors to U.S. presidents and the former president of CIA operated Radio Free Europe. This report also cites UK Parliament and the US Department of Treasury several times. It also cites various articles from Western media organizations like the BBC, which is British state media, New York Times, the Globe and Mail, Bloomberg, the Times, etc. Most, if not all, of these articles source CIA propaganda. The report itself is partially funded by the Freedom Fund, which itself is funded by the governments of the US, UK, and Norway. There are 3 authors of this report. The most prominent seems to be David Tobin, as this report cites other works by him multiple times. He has spoken at events from the NED-funded Uyghur Human Rights Project. He has worked with the World Uyghur Congress connected Uyghur Tribunal on a report about Xinjiang documents released by the CIA-funded anti-Semite who can't read or speak Mandarin yet translates Chinese documents, Adrian Zenz. And a quick browse through his Twitter shows he constantly retweets National Endowment for Democracy-funded Uyghur organizations like the Campaign for Uyghurs, which was started by Rushan Abbas, a U.S. government contractor who worked with the 22 Uyghurs that the U.S. tortured in Guantanamo Bay, and who was also a reporter for the CIA-operated Radio Free Asia. Wow. Do you see what I mean? It's CIA-funded nonsense through and through. Let's see what else this Walk Free report says about the People's Republic of China. State-imposed forced labor also occurs in re-education camps in China, footnote 13. Footnote 13 cites the aforementioned defense contractor and Western government-funded Center for Strategic and International Studies. Next on this Walk Free report, we get a 2-page spread about China and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. This should be good. Since the 2018 Global Slavery Index, there has been a growing body of evidence that state-imposed forced labor of Uyghurs and other Turkic and Muslim majority groups in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, Uyghur region of China. Growing body of evidence. Why do you think that is? Is it perhaps because the US decided to capitalize on the negative China sentiment from COVID? Did they perhaps take advantage of that situation and decide to ramp up their xenophobic propaganda that Western liberals just love to eat up? Footnote 77 from that little quote has several citations, including the aforementioned defense contractor funded Australian Strategic Policy Institute, CSIS again, a few different reports from the Sheffield Hallam University featuring the same authors again, which all source the same CIA nonsense, a Washington Post article that sources the ASPI, a BBC article that sources Adrian Zenz, a New York Times article about a US government ban on Xinjiang products that also sources Adrian Zenz, and the latest 2022 UN report about Xinjiang, the same report that could not even say for certain that China was committing human rights violations. They only say they may have committed human rights violations. Abuse of compulsory prison labor and forced labor for economic development forms part of a wider, decades-long campaign to exercise control of Uyghurs. Footnote 78 has several more citations, including 2 New York Times articles. The first sources Rabia Kadir, who runs the NED-funded terrorist group ETIM supporting World Uyghur Congress. The second is, funnily enough, about one of ETIM's terror attacks in Tiananmen Square. Watch your social credit score. This is clear justification for the PRC's de-radicalization efforts for the small portion of ETIM-influenced Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but of course, Walk Free and the New York Times spin it as unfair persecution by the Communist Party of China. This footnote also has 2 Human Rights Watch reports. These are fun, since xenophobic Western liberals love to claim that organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are unbiased. The first Human Rights Watch report starts out by saying this: the scope of this research was severely limited because Human Rights Watch researchers are unable to safely carry out research in Xinjiang. I wonder why. Footnote 1 and 2 in this article both cite an Adrian Zenz article from the Jamestown Foundation. Footnotes 9 and 10 cite Radio Free Asia. Right, that's why. I stopped reading this report after that. On to the next. The second Human Rights Watch report is about Chinese officials visiting people's homes in Xinjiang to see how they live. They obviously find a way to spin this as repression, but it's more likely that these officials are just making sure that the Uyghurs are living a good enough life in Xinjiang. The initiative is called Visit the People, Benefit the People, and Get Together the Hearts of the People. It is what they say it is. There's no reason to believe otherwise. They typically stay with Muslim families, though sometimes cadres are dispatched to stay with Han families. This article admits that these cadres stay with Han families as well as Uyghur families, which seems to disprove that this is a targeted campaign against the Uyghurs. Human Rights Watch has a section in this report titled Background on Chinese Repression in Xinjiang. To prove the repression, they cite their own various Human Rights Watch reports. This is one way that they obfuscate their sources, by hiding them through layers and layers of nonsense. Most people won't sift through these various reports. I am not most people. I sifted through every single one of them. Number 1. China passports arbitrarily recalled in Xinjiang. It links to a report. A search for Radio Free Asia gives 3 results. A search for Uyghur Human Rights Project gives 2 results. Number 2. Egypt. Don't deport Uyghurs to China. It cites Radio Free Asia directly. The Radio Free Asia article cites anonymous sources, as always. Number 3. China. Free Xinjiang political education detainees. It cites Radio Free Asia directly twice, as well as that Jamestown Foundation article from Adrian Zenz. Number 4. China. Big data fuels crackdown in minority region. Cites the Jamestown Foundation twice. One of the Jamestown Foundation articles is authored by Kevin McCauley, who has spent the majority of his 30-plus year career in the U.S. government as the senior intelligence officer with the U.S. Army National Ground Intelligence Center in Virginia. Number 5. China. Minority region collects DNA from millions. It cites all of the previous 4 and the next Human Rights Watch reports to obfuscate sources. Number 6. China. Voice biometric collection threatens privacy. This one doesn't directly cite any suspicious sources, but it makes a mountain out of a molehill as always. This is a common trend with these Human Rights Watch reports. They cite some new technology that China and most of the developed world uses, but they say it's only bad when China does it because of all the other propaganda that they've spread about China. The Chinese government has been collecting the voice patterns of tens of thousands of people with little transparency about the program or laws regulating who can be targeted or how that information is going to be used, said Sophie Richardson, China director. Authorities can easily misuse that data in a country with a long history of unchecked surveillance and retaliation against critics. Then, later in the article, other governments have used automated speech recognition programs, including the United States for monitoring prison calls, and Australia for verifying callers accessing social services. The Spanish police have more than 3,500 voice samples from people convicted of crimes. But it's only bad when China does it, right, Human Rights Watch? Alright, back to that Walk Free report. State-imposed forced labor reportedly occurs alongside political indoctrination, religious oppression, mass surveillance, forced separation of families, forced sterilization, sexual violence, and arbitrary detention in so-called re-education camps within the Uyghur region. Footnote 79 cites the defense contractor-funded ASPI twice. It cites 4 more Human Rights Watch reports. I'm not going to go over all of them again, but one of them is a long report that is often cited by Western media, so we'll cover that one. Break their lineage, break their roots. China's crimes against humanity targeting Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. Footnote 2 of this report cites the National Endowment for Democracy funded Uyghur Human Rights Project. Footnotes 3, 4, and 5 cite the ASPI. Footnote 6 cites Adrian Zenz. That's enough. Let's move on. Footnote 79 from the Walk Free report also cites the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists twice. These articles are about the China cables, which are documents released by an anonymous hacker that were verified as legitimate by none other than Adrian Zenz himself. Both ICIJ articles directly cite Zenz, who, once again, can't even speak or read Mandarin, yet can verify the authenticity of these Chinese reports. Walk Free then sources a very fancy interactive New Yorker article in footnote 79. It makes the claim of over 1 million Uyghurs detained and links to a China File article that says that that number comes from Adrian Zenz, Radio Free Asia, and the ASPI. It sources an Associated Press article about IUDs, quote-unquote forced sterilization, that features Zenz's false data. It sources the ASPI twice about satellite data. You can't see torture from space, ASPI. Finally, it sources a BuzzFeed News article that cites Adrian Zenz, the ASPI, CSIS, and the U.S. State Department. Back in footnote 79, we've got a New Lines Institute report. A search for Zenz shows 41 results. Radio Free Asia, 22 results. Wow. They actually cite Zenz and RFA more than that because of all the IBID, which means in the same place, footnotes. ASPI also shows up at least 3 times, and Uyghur Human Rights Project at least 6 times. This is a big footnote, number 79. It has an Associated Press article in it that cites Zenz directly. It has a BBC article that cites Zenz directly. It has a Guardian article featuring an Uyghur woman who works with various National Endowment for Democracy funded organizations to shill her book. It has a UN report from 2022 that cites Adrian Zenz and the ASPI multiple times. And finally, it has an Amnesty International report, which we'll take a look at because, like Human Rights Watch, I sure love to prove how biased they are. Like we were enemies in a war. China's mass internment, torture, and persecution of Muslims in Xinjiang. The evidence Amnesty International has gathered provides a factual basis for the conclusion that the Chinese government has committed at least the following crimes against humanity: imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of fundamental rules of international law, torture, and persecution. Factual basis? We'll see. Search for Zens gives 8 results, ASPI 16 results, Radio Free Asia 16 results, Uyghur Human Rights Project 9 results. Hey, Amnesty International? Nothing that comes from these CIA-funded sources are factual. You clowns. We're finally done with footnote 79, and we're going to blast through the rest of them from this 2-page spread because they don't have as many links as the previous footnote. Footnote 80 cites the NED-funded Uyghur Human Rights Project, then 2 unsourced articles that state that the Dutch Parliament and US government say that China is committing genocide. Of course they would. Footnote 81 cites 2 UN reports that prove that the PRC is enriching the Xinjiang region, yet Walk Free baselessly claims they are lying, under the guise of poverty alleviation and vocational training. It's not a guise. The Communist Party of China is alleviating poverty and training the Uyghurs to enter the workforce, just as they claim. Footnote 82 cites a BBC article that sources Adrian Zenz, CSIS, and the ASPI. It cites a Guardian article that sources a coalition of various National Endowment for Democracy funded Uyghur advocacy organizations like the World Uyghur Congress and the Campaign for Uyghurs. It also sources the NED-funded Uyghur Human Rights Project directly. Finally, it cites another report from the Sheffield Hallam University, which sources Adrian Zenz 16 times, ASPI 3 times, and Radio Free Asia 4 times. Footnote 83 cites a CSIS report and an ASPI report. Footnote 84 cites the U.S. Department of State and the same ASPI report from the last footnote. Oh, and by the way, that ASPI report cites Adrian Zenz and CSIS, of course. Footnote 85 is yet another Sheffield Hallam University report that cites Adrian Zenz, Radio Free Asia, and the ASPI. Footnote 86 cites a New York Times article that sources Adrian Zenz directly, a Bitter Winter report that sources Zenz directly, and a Washington Post article that I had to find an archive for because my paywall busting software could not get past it. It sources the ASPI. Footnote 87 is, once again, another Sheffield Hallam University report that cites Adrian Zenz 8 times, the ASPI 4 times, and Radio Free Asia once. Footnote 88 is an Investors for Human Rights article that sources the same Sheffield Hallam University report from the previous footnote. Footnote 89 cites a CSIS report, an ASPI report, the same Bitter Winter report from footnote 86, a UN report from 2022 that cites Zenz 3 times, and 2 more SHU reports that we have already shown cite CIA nonsense. Footnote 90 cites a ASPI report. Footnote 91 cites a Wall Street Journal article that sources Zenz directly, the same ASPI report from several of these footnotes, the same CSIS report from several of these footnotes, and the Washington Post article from footnote 86. Footnote 92 cites the same ASPI report and the same CSIS report once again. Footnote 93 cites a Reuters article that sources Zenz, the Jamestown Foundation, and the ASPI, and it also cites the same UN report from footnote 89 that sources Zenz. Footnote 94 cites a Xinjiang Victims Database profile that sources Radio Free Asia and CSIS. Footnote 95 cites a U.S. Department of State report and an SHU report we've already gone over. Footnote 96 cites the same BBC article from footnote 82 that sources Adrian Zenz, CSIS, and the ASPI. Footnote 97 cites a report from the National Endowment for Democracy funded Uyghur Human Rights Project. That report cites Radio Free Asia 8 times. Footnote 98 cites a South China Morning Post article that sources Atajurt Kazakh Human Rights. I've never heard of them. They don't have a website, but they tweet out Radio Free Asia articles, of course. Footnote 99 sources a call to action from that same coalition of NED-funded orgs from footnote 82. Footnote 100 cites the National Endowment for Democracy Uyghur Human Rights Project again, and also has a handy list of all the different sanctions the US and other Western countries have levied against China and Xinjiang to take work away from innocent Uyghur Muslims. Nice work, guys. Finally, that's the end of this 2-page spread in the Walk Free report. That was 24 footnotes full of CIA propaganda. Not a single shred of tangible evidence either. Just hearsay released or funded by China's biggest geopolitical rival, the USA. I don't understand why no one in the West seems to try to challenge these obviously biased sources. The US constantly lies about their rivals to fuel the war machine and to stuff defense contractors' pockets. They did it with Iraq twice, at least. The Naira testimony was used as a reason to bomb the hell out of Iraq in the early 90s, and it was proven false. Naira was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. They just made it all up. Funnily enough, just like with the Uyghur propaganda, it was corroborated at first by Amnesty International. And who can forget the Iraq has WMD lie after 9/11? It was also completely made up, and it was proven that they had no WMD after the invasion and occupation of Iraq. The US more or less destroyed the country and caused over 1 million unnecessary deaths just for us to realize that they lied about the entire basis for their invasion. In response to the about 3,000 people that died when the World Trade Center towers fell, the US committed a terror attack twice as bad. Fueled by the WMD lie, the shock and awe campaign in Baghdad killed over 6,000 innocent civilians. The US is doing it again, and no one in the West seems to care. We'll look back on these times about 20 or so years from now with the same amount of disgust that we currently hold for the Iraq lies. Me and the other rational leftists who are currently speaking out about this will say, "I told you so," and you probably won't care, and you'll go on to believe whatever new nonsense the US is spreading about their latest geopolitical enemies. Now, like this video and subscribe to this channel, or I'll examine the footnotes about you.